The smell of whiskey and unwashed men filled the dusty saloon as Bryce Lantry's voice cut through the desert heat like a rusty blade. "Gentlemen, what we have here is pure Apache gold. 17 years old, untouched, and worth every penny you'll pay." The crowd of rough ranchers and drifters pressed closer to the makeshift stage where a young woman stood with her head down, her long black hair covering her face like a shield against the hungry eyes devouring her. This was Ayoka, daughter of the wind according to her people, now reduced to merchandise in a land that had forgotten mercy. Silas McCall sat in the corner, his weathered hands wrapped around a glass of water he hadn't touched. At 65, he had seen enough of this world to know when something was deeply wrong, and everything about this moment screamed injustice. The girl's hands were bound with rope, her traditional dress torn and dirty from whatever journey had brought her to this nightmare. Her dark eyes held a fire that even fear couldn't extinguish, reminding him of his own daughter Sarah, who would have been about the same age if the fever hadn't taken her 15 years ago. $20 to start the bidding, Lantry announced, his gold teeth glinting in the afternoon light streaming through the saloon's grimy windows. A fat man in an expensive suit raised his hand immediately. "25, called another voice from the back. The price climbed as Silas watched the girl's shoulders tremble with each shout from the crowd. She was trying to disappear, to fold into herself until she became invisible, but there was nowhere to hide on that wooden platform. The town of Bitter Creek existed in a lawless pocket of the New Mexico territory where the sheriff asked no questions as long as his palm was greased regularly. Lantry had been running his human trafficking operation for 3 years, buying desperate natives from corrupt Indian agents and selling them to men who saw them as less than human. The military turned a blind eye, the territorial government pretended not to know, and decent folks stayed indoors when Lantry's auctions took place. $50, shouted a rancher Silas recognized as Tom Bradley, a man known for working his horses to death. The girl flinched as if struck. Silas had heard the stories about Bradley's ranch, how native workers disappeared in the night and were never seen again. His jaw tightened as he thought about his late wife Martha, who had always told him that a man's character was measured by how he treated those who couldn't fight back. 65, came another bid. Lantry's smile grew wider with each increase, his pale eyes scanning the crowd for more money. The girl lifted her head slightly, and Silas caught a glimpse of her face. She was beautiful in the way desert flowers were beautiful, delicate but born to survive harsh conditions. But more than that, he saw something in her expression that reminded him of a wild horse he had once found caught in barbed wire, terrified but not broken, still believing in the possibility of freedom. The memories came flooding back unbidden. Martha braiding their daughter's hair in the morning sunlight. Sarah's laughter echoing through their cabin. The fever that took them both in a single terrible week, leaving him alone in a world that suddenly held no meaning. He had built walls around his heart after that, walls higher than the red mesas surrounding Bitter Creek, telling himself that caring only led to loss. $75, Bradley called out again, and Silas saw the girl close her eyes as if preparing for a death sentence. Something stirred in the old rancher's chest, something he thought had died with his family. It was the same feeling that had once made him ride into Apache raids to rescue wounded soldiers, the same impulse that had driven him to build a reputation as a man who kept his word even when it cost him everything. The bidding had reached $85 when Silas finally stood up. His chair scraped against the wooden floor, and several heads turned in his direction. He was not a big man, but there was something in his presence that made other men step aside. Years of hard living had carved lines into his face like canyon walls, and his gray eyes held the kind of quiet authority that came from facing death and walking away. "She rides with me," he said simply, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. Lantry's laughter cut through the silence like a coyote's howl in the night. "Old man, you haven't even made a bid. The current price is $85, and these gentlemen here have real money to spend." His hand moved casually to the pistol at his hip, a gesture not lost on anyone in the room. The other bidders shifted nervously, unsure whether they were about to witness a business transaction or a gunfight. Silas stepped forward slowly, his boots echoing on the warped floorboards. He had left his gun belt at home deliberately, knowing that violence would only make things worse for the girl. Instead, he He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, the contents clinking softly as he set it on the nearest table. $200 in gold coin, he said quietly. More than any of these men will pay, and more than she's worth to your kind of business. The girl's head snapped up at the sound of his voice, and for the first time since the auction began, hope flickered in her dark eyes. She had learned enough English during her time in captivity to understand what was happening, though she couldn't comprehend why this weathered stranger would pay such a sum for her freedom. In her Apache tradition, honor was measured by actions, not words, and something in this man's bearing spoke of the kind of honor her grandfather had taught her to recognize. Bradley pushed forward, his face red with anger and alcohol. 200? That's more than I paid for my last 3 horses combined. What's an old hermit like you want with a savage girl anyway? His crude words hung in the air like smoke from a dirty fire, and Silas felt his hands clench into fists. But he had learned long ago that some battles were won with patience rather than violence. My business is my own, Silas replied, his voice steady as stone. The money's real, and it's more than fair. Cut her loose. He looked directly at Lantry, and something in his gaze made the trafficker take an involuntary step backward. Silas McCall had a reputation in this territory, not as a gunfighter or a brawler, but as a man who kept his promises and settled his debts. When he said something would happen, it happened. Lantry's eyes darted between the gold coins and the faces of the other bidders, calculating odds and risks. The old rancher had called his bluff by offering more money than anyone else in the room could match, and backing down now would make him look weak in front of his customers. But there was something in McCall's eyes that suggested crossing him would be a mistake that might not be forgiven or forgotten. Fine, Lantry said finally, motioning to one of his men to cut the ropes binding Ayoka's wrists. But the sale is final, old man. No refunds if your purchase doesn't meet your expectations. His words carried an ugly implication that made several men in the crowd chuckle, but Silas ignored them. He had heard worse from better men. The rope fell away from Ayoka's hands, and she rubbed her wrists where the coarse fibers had cut into her skin. She looked around the room like a cornered animal, unsure whether this was another trap or a genuine rescue. Trust did not come easily to someone who had been betrayed by every white person she had encountered since her capture 3 months ago. Silas approached the platform slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements deliberate. "Can you ride?" he asked in heavily accented Apache, the words clumsy but recognizable. Her eyes widened in surprise. Few white men bothered to learn even basic phrases in her language, and fewer still spoke them with genuine respect rather than mockery. "Yes," she replied in English, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first word she had spoken since being brought to the saloon, and it carried the weight of a small victory. She stepped down from the platform on unsteady legs, her body stiff from hours of standing in one position while men discussed her fate like livestock. Outside, the New Mexico sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty street. Silas had tied his horse in a spare mount to the hitching post, anticipating this moment even though he hadn't planned it when he rode into town that morning. Sometimes a man found himself at a crossroads where doing nothing was worse than doing something dangerous, and this was one of those times. He helped Ayoka onto the smaller horse, a gentle mare named Star who had belonged to his daughter years ago. The saddle was old but well maintained, and he adjusted the stirrups without asking permission, working with the efficient movements of someone who had spent his life around horses. She watched his hands carefully, noting how he treated the animal with quiet respect. As they prepared to leave Bitter Creek, Silas could feel hostile eyes watching from the saloon windows. Lantry would not forget this humiliation, and Bradley's type held grudges like rattlesnakes held venom. The $200 had bought more than Ayoka's freedom, it had bought them both a target that would follow them across the desert. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when they finally rode out of town, two unlikely companions bound together by circumstance and heading toward an uncertain future. Behind them, Bitter Creek shimmered in the heat like a mirage, and ahead lay the vast emptiness of the territorial Badlands where a man's past mattered less than his ability to survive another day. The ride to Silas's ranch took them through 20 miles of red rock canyons and desert scrub, a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly under the burning sky. They traveled in silence for the first hour, each lost in their own thoughts and uncertainties. Ioka kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see dust clouds from pursuing riders, while Silas scanned the horizon with the practiced eye of someone who had learned that trouble in this territory usually came from directions you weren't watching. When they stopped to water the horses at a small creek hidden between two mesas, Silas finally broke the silence. "My name is Silas McCall," he said, offering her a canteen of fresh water. "I have a ranch about 10 miles ahead. You'll be safe there." His voice carried a certainty that Ioka wanted desperately to believe, though her experience had taught her that safety was often just another word for a different kind of prison. "Why?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since he paid for her freedom. She studied his weathered face, looking for signs of the hidden motivations that seemed to drive all white men in her experience. Some wanted to possess her, others to save their own souls through acts of charity, but none had ever simply wanted to help without expecting something in return. Silas was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow over the smooth stones. "I had a daughter once," he said finally. "About your age when she died. Sometimes a man gets a chance to do something right after doing too many things wrong. Maybe this is mine." There was no self-pity in his words, just the simple honesty of someone who had made peace with his losses but not with his failures. The ranch appeared as they crested a low hill just as the sun touched the western mountains. It was modest but well-maintained, with a sturdy cabin, a barn that had seen better days, and corrals that spoke of a man who took pride in his work even when no one was watching. Chickens scattered as they rode into the yard, and an old dog emerged from the shade to greet them with a tail wag that seemed genuinely welcoming. "You can have the spare room," Silas said as they dismounted. "It was my daughter's. The door has a lock if that makes you feel safer." He unsaddled the horses with efficient movements, his hands gentle with the animals despite their obvious strength. Ioka noticed how he spoke to them softly in English, the same tone he had used with her earlier. That first night, she barely slept. Every sound outside the window made her tense, expecting Lantry's men to come crashing through the darkness. But morning came peacefully, with the smell of coffee and bacon drifting from the kitchen and the sound of Silas moving quietly around the cabin. When she emerged from her room, she found breakfast waiting on the table and clean clothes folded on a chair. "They belong to my wife," he explained without embarrassment. "She was about your size." The dress was simple but well-made, a far cry from the torn traditional clothing she had worn since her capture. As she changed, Ioka caught sight of herself in a small mirror and was startled by how different she looked. Not white, but not quite the same Apache girl who had been stolen from her people either. The days fell into a routine that felt strange in its normalcy. Silas taught her to tend the vegetable garden, to gather eggs from the chickens, to help with the horses. He never demanded these things, but offered them as ways to fill the long hours between sunrise and sunset. Slowly, carefully, she began to speak more English, and he continued his halting attempts at Apache words. On the fourth night, the dog started barking. Silas was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with a rifle he kept loaded by the door. In the distance, orange flames licked at the sky where his hay barn stood. "Stay inside," he told Ioka, but she was already moving toward the back door. 3 years of captivity had taught her that hiding was often more dangerous than running. As they watched the barn burn, dark figures moved in the shadows beyond the firelight. Lantry had come to collect what he considered stolen property, and he had brought enough men to make sure Silas McCall learned the cost of interfering with his business. The real test of their unlikely alliance was about to begin. The flames from the burning barn cast dancing shadows across the ranch as Lantry's voice cut through the night air. "McCall, send the girl out and we'll call it even. Keep her, and you'll lose more than a barn tonight." 6 men emerged from the darkness, their weapons glinting in the firelight like the eyes of hungry wolves. They had positioned themselves strategically around the cabin, cutting off obvious escape routes. Silas checked his rifle again, knowing that 6 bullets wouldn't be enough against 6 men, especially when some of them likely had military training. This wasn't going to be one with gunfire. "I've got a better idea," he called back. "You and your men ride out now, and I won't report your barn burning to the territorial marshal when he comes through next week." Lantry's laughter was harsh and mocking. "What marshal? You think anyone cares about one old man and his Indian pet out here in the middle of nowhere?" But there was something forced about his confidence, a brittleness that suggested he wasn't as sure of his position as he wanted to appear. Men like Lantry thrived on intimidating the isolated and helpless, but Silas McCall had a reputation that extended beyond Bitter Creek. While the men talked, Ioka had slipped out the back door and was moving through the shadows with the silent grace her grandfather had taught her during hunting lessons that seemed like a lifetime ago. She had spent 3 months as a victim, 3 months being treated like property to be bought and sold. But watching Silas risk everything for a stranger had awakened something in her that captivity had tried to kill. She was Apache, daughter of people who had survived in this harsh land for generations, and it was time to remember what that meant. The ranch's water well stood 30 yards behind the cabin, fed by an underground spring that never ran dry even in the worst droughts. Silas had mentioned during their daily conversations that it connected to the same water system that fed the creek where they had stopped on their first day. What he hadn't mentioned, but what Ioka had noticed, was that the well had been deepened recently, and that the sound of water flowing underground was much stronger than it should have been for a simple domestic well. Working quickly and silently, she began dismantling the wooden cover that protected the well from debris. Underneath, just as she had suspected, was not just a narrow shaft but the opening to a larger cave system. Her people had always known about these hidden passages through the Red Rock country, but white settlers rarely bothered to explore them. It was a way out that Lantry's men would never think to guard. Back at the cabin, Silas was buying time with conversation, drawing out negotiations while keeping one eye on the spreading fire. "You know, Lantry, there's something you should consider before this goes any further. The girl you're so eager to get back? She's not the same frightened child you sold a week ago. She's been learning things. About this land, about her rights under territorial law, about which territorial officials might be very interested in your business practices." There was truth in his words that even Lantry could hear. In the past week, Ioka had begun to understand that her captivity, while horrible, had also taught her things about the white world that could be useful. She could read basic English now, she understood how their legal system claimed to work, and she had learned to recognize the difference between men like Lantry and men like Silas. A soft whistle came from behind the cabin, the call of a desert nightbird that Silas recognized as distinctly human. Ioka was telling him she had found another option. He smiled grimly and made his choice. "Here's my final offer, Lantry. The girl and I are leaving. You can try to stop us, or you can go back to Bitter Creek and tell your customers that Silas McCall is someone they don't want to cross. Your choice." Without waiting for an answer, Silas grabbed a bag of supplies he had prepared and headed for the back door. Behind him, angry shouts erupted as Lantry's men realized their quarry was escaping. But by the time they reached the back of the cabin, both Silas and Ioka had vanished into the desert night as completely as if the earth had swallowed them. They emerged from the cave system 3 miles away, near the creek where they had first stopped to water their horses. The underground passage had been cramped and dark, but it had delivered them beyond the reach of Lantry's immediate vengeance. As they caught their breath under the desert stars, Silas looked at his unlikely partner with new respect. "How did you know about the caves?" he asked. "My grandfather taught me to watch the land, to see what others miss," she replied. "Water always finds the deepest places, and people always overlook what they cannot immediately understand." There was pride in her voice, the first time since her rescue that she had spoken as an equal rather than a victim. In the months that followed, Silas rebuilt his barn with Ioka's help. She learned to read and write properly, while teaching him more of her language and the desert survival skills that had kept her people alive for centuries. Lantry made one more attempt at revenge, but found that a 65-year-old rancher and a young Apache woman made formidable opponents when they worked together. Word eventually reached them that territorial authorities, acting on an anonymous tip delivered in perfect English, had shut down Lantry's operation and arrested him for human trafficking. Justice in the New Mexico territory was often slow and imperfect, but it still existed for those patient enough to pursue it. Ioka never returned to her original tribe, but she created a new kind of family with the old rancher who had seen her worth when others saw only opportunity. They were an unlikely pair, but the desert had a way of bringing together people who belonged together, regardless of what the rest of the world thought about it. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the horses were settled for the night, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the red mesas. Silas had found a new purpose in life, and Ayoka had discovered that freedom wasn't just about escaping captivity, but about choosing your own path forward. Sometimes the most important family is the one you create for yourself, one decision at a time. Thank you for watching this incredible journey of courage, honor, and unexpected friendship in the American West. If this story moved you as much as it moved us to tell it, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful historical tales that explore the human spirit in its darkest and brightest moments. What did you think of Silas and Ayoka's story? Drop a comment below and let us know which character's transformation touched you the most. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our weekly stories that prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who change everything. Until next time, keep believing in the power of doing what's right, even when it's not easy.